right. Boom. There we go. So here we are, the carbon cycle. We didn't get a chance to talk about this, correct? I don't think we did. And so oftentimes on exams, and I believe this is probably one of the questions on your test in October. In fact, I'm pretty confident it is. Basically, you have to just draw the carbon cycle. And this is probably something that you did in middle school. It's probably something you did with Dr. Price. It's pretty gosh darn straightforward. And the good news is you don't have to remember every single sink and every single flow. You just have to have a couple in your I don't know, in your arsenal to use when you're drawing the carbon cycle. And so before I get too crazy, I probably should tell you what a sink and what a flow is. Maybe you already know. Do you guys know what a sink and a flow is when it comes to the carbon cycle?
No.
Nope. So a sink is where large amounts of carbon is stored. We will talk about sinks when we talk about the movement of sugar in plants, which is called translocation. But in this case, we're thinking much bigger. We're thinking about the movement of carbon all over the world. And this is obviously a really important and pressing conversation because we're obviously dealing with human-caused climate change, which has a great deal to do with our tendency through industrialization to add all of this additional carbon to the atmosphere, which is creating all sorts of issues with weather. And so a store or a sink is where carbon resides. And there's lots and lots of different stores and sinks. Some pretty straightforward ones would be like the air, the atmosphere. That's usually one we think of when we think about sinks or stores. There's also soil. Soil is a big store. And there's different types of soil. And so, carbon is stored in forests, but it's also stored in like, peat, which is soil that's become acidified. So it doesn't really decompose. Like there's peat bogs. There's carbon in water. And so our oceans and lakes absorb carbon dioxide, and they're a store as well. There's carbon stores in man-made things. So concrete is a carbon store. It holds lots and lots of carbon as well. And so a store or a sink is anywhere in which carbon resides. And when you're drawing a store or a sink, because those words are often used kind of interchangeably, you can represent it as a box. Kids love to flex their artistic talent, and they love to draw really elaborate carbon cycle diagrams. I would advise you against that. I don't think it's a good use of your time, especially if you're trying to navigate a big old exam. And so instead, just use a box for your sinks or your stores, and then just label the box inside the box with the atmosphere or with a forest or with the ocean or whatever. Don't like do these elaborate drawings of cows or trees or whatever. It's just not a good use of anybody's time. I also mentioned another term, and that is a flow or a flux. And a flow and a flux is, got to be careful when I say flux, is how carbon moves from one store or sink to another. And there's some different processes that you're probably already aware of, like cell respiration is a flux. And so when we're breathing in to use oxygen to convert glucose into ATP, we're obviously breathing out carbon dioxide. And so cell respiration is moving carbon from our bodies out into the atmosphere. And then vice versa, what will be the opposite of that? What's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and moving it into an organic or an organism?
Photosynthesis.
Yeah. So that's the other side of the coin, right? And so photosynthesis and cell respiration are both examples of flows or fluxes. We mentioned climate change earlier and combustion. And so whether that's via our automobiles or factories is a flow. And that's going to bring more carbon into the atmosphere, which is, again, kind of problematic. Some more positive I guess some more positive types of flows would be like sedimentation or fossilization. So when carbon is getting taken out of the air and it's being brought into the soil and then maybe converted into rock, that is a flow. There's what else? We said combustion, cell respiration, photosynthesis, sedimentation, fossilization. There is dissolving. So there's probably a better word for it, but basically the process of carbon dioxide getting pulled out of the air into water sources is another flow. And so what I would recommend is just kind of knowing 3 to 4 sinks or stores and knowing 3 to 4 flows. And if you can put that, oops.
The best way,
Yikes! If you can put that into a diagram, that'd be great. Now, just one other note, and maybe we'll just watch a couple minutes of this video where he details how to draw the carbon cycle. But the best way, or one more note, I should say, is that sometimes carbon is solid, sometimes carbon is a gas, and sometimes carbon is a gas in a liquid. And so there's some different forms of carbon as well. But let's just watch this really quick and see if you can draw a carbon cycle.
to remember the carbon cycle is to think of all the different places where carbon is stored and then try to remember how it moves between them. Most of the carbon is split between 5 stores. In the air, where it's carbon dioxide. In plants, where it's locked up in biological molecules. In the soil, which contains lots of bacteria and other microorganisms. In fossil fuels, which are also underground. And of course in animals, where like plants is locked up in biological molecules. So now that we know these different stores, let's look at how carbon moves between them. The most important process is photosynthesis, in which green plants and algae take in the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into biological molecules like glucose. This carbon that's now locked up inside them can then do 2 things. It can be passed back out to the atmosphere by respiration, or passed on to animals that eat the plants. And of course the animals themselves could then also respire to release carbon dioxide. When these plants and animals die though, 2 more things can happen to the carbon. One is that the organisms are decayed by microorganisms that live in the warm, moist, aerobic conditions of the soil. These will break them into smaller and smaller pieces until all of the carbon has been released as carbon dioxide during microbial respiration. However, if the dead organisms somehow avoid being decayed like this, and instead are decayed in anaerobic conditions, so without oxygen, then they might slowly be converted into fossil fuels, like oil, natural gas, or coal. And all of these fossil fuels can then be burned by humans to produce carbon dioxide again. And that's pretty much the carbon cycle. Although you could add an arrow for the burning of plants, like burning logs in a fire or...
So I forgot consumption and decomposition as fossil fuels. 1 second, I'm just gonna let my dog out. There's a deer in the front yard. So. Sorry about that. Right. So does that kind of make sense in terms of sinks, or sometimes they're called sources, and then also flows, and sometimes they're called fluxes?
Yes.
Yep. And so the video had a really elaborate kind of diagram. Again, don't do that. You're great just with representing stores as boxes. And then you can just use arrows and label those arrows to represent the flows. So this is, again, pretty basic stuff. I'm sure you first talked about the carbon cycle or maybe the water cycle in maybe middle school or maybe even elementary school. And it's just one of those things that just keeps coming up over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, but not too difficult to get a grasp on. So that is one thing that we didn't get to last week. And so Maya, That's a little bit of a C4.2. There were a couple other things in C4.2 that I wanted to highlight before we move on to D4. The good news is D4 is pretty short, so there's not a whole heck of a lot to chat about in terms of D4. A lot of it is just kind of knowing different examples of how ecosystems become unstable. And so we talked about sinks and sources. Here they differentiate between sinks and sources, sinks being something that absorbs carbon and sources being something that releases carbon. You know, I don't really think the IB really makes that distinction. And so I think you can get away with using those interchangeably. It's not the end of the world. And then we talked a little bit about some of the examples of fluxes. Just gonna move forward here. Okay, so there's also a really famous kind of representation of how combustion has increased the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it just focuses in on the flux between animals and the air. So from one store to another, and it's called the Keeling curve. And you may have seen this before. I know that Dr. Price does tackle the Keeling curve in 10th grade, but it was developed at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. Have either of you ever been to Hawaii?
No.
No, it's pretty remote. I'm not surprised. Most Americans haven't even been to Hawaii. So, but perhaps you've seen this. I'm going to skip ahead. So this doesn't look super interesting, right? But basically what it's showing is the presence of carbon dioxide in at this particular observatory in Hawaii from 1960, before 1960, I think 1958 or something, all the way to the present. And they're continuing to do this today. And so it cuts off here at 2022, but this is still very, very much in effect. And so on an IB exam, you might see the Keeling curve. It's a pretty popular diagram. Sometimes it shows up on paper 1B as kind of a test of how you can interpret curves. And so you just kind of want to look at some different things here. First, whenever you're looking at a curve in science or a graph in science, you want to just take a look at the title and the axes, because as you've done firsthand when you completed your IA, you know that graphs and tables should stand alone. And so if I were to pick this graph up off the ground, I should be able to interpret it just based on the titles and axes within the graph itself. Like there's no descriptor necessary. And so it says monthly mean of carbon dioxide concentration. And so even though the axes lists years along the bottom, we know that it's actually going to be measured in 12 different increments per year. And then on the y-axis, you have the CO2 fraction in the year, and this is like a relatively small amount, but it has a huge impact in kind of inhibiting those greenhouse gases from escaping back out into the atmosphere. And so you'll notice, as you'd expect, that with industrialization and rising populations, the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased. Would you call this logistic or exponential?
Exponential.
Yeah, it's exponential. So it's a bit like the curves we were looking at with population, where you're seeing this rapid kind of rise of carbon dioxide. But what's more interesting, I guess, is what's happening within the years. And within the years, what we're seeing is kind of a rise and fall. And this is where things get a little confusing. Why do we think that each year there is a rise and a fall of carbon dioxide?
Maybe something to do with the climate, like weather.
Yeah, weather, but like seasonally, what do we see happening throughout the year? Does even in Hawaii, are we gonna get just one uniform season?
No.
No, we're gonna get
Like
fall.
summer.
Yeah, we'll get fall and spring and winter, right? And so what's crazy here, what's really interesting is that we see this carbon dioxide, it increases, and I think this is is this the Northern Hemisphere summer? Yeah, this is in the Northern hemisphere. Oh, and this is in the southern hemisphere, excuse me. And so like Australia and like Brazil, when we're looking at, January to April, this is fall, right? And so the carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere in the fall because we don't have trees actively photosynthesizing. But then fall turns to winter, right around here. And then as spring emerges and then gets into summer, we see those carbon dioxide levels drop as plants start to photosynthesize. And so on an IB exam, what you'll be asked is, okay, what's the overall trend? Ooh, do we have another guest? Perhaps?
I think Diane left, but she might come back. I'm not
Oh.
sure what happened.
All right, I'm bringing her back in. Maybe her internet isn't so hot. Guyan, are you there? All right, we'll keep rocking and rolling. And so again, yeah, just on an IB exam, you're going to see 2 questions asked. What's the overall trend? So this is an exponential increase in carbon dioxide that is just continuing as we move into the future. And then on a more micro level, you're seeing this rise and fall of carbon dioxide that is dependent on the seasons. Guyan, we were so worried. Are you okay? You're back.
Yeah, my internet cut off.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Do you think it was Guyun? Did she sabotage you?
Yeah, she did.
Classic Guyun. Classic Guyun. That's why you gotta have the internet modem in your room or the router in your room so she can't mess with it. So Guyun, we were just talking about the 2 things that you'd be asked about this Keeling curve. And the number 1 thing is that, okay, I'm noticing that carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere over the last 60 years. Like that's not a question at all, right? But then they'll ask you a follow-up question and they'll ask you, okay, what's happening seasonally? And seasonally, we're seeing rises in the fall of carbon dioxide because there's no plants photosynthesizing. And then we're seeing drops in the spring. And so the trickiest part of this whole thing is this is all happening in the southern hemisphere. So it seems counterintuitive. Like in our northern hemisphere, we're going to see the opposite. But here in Hawaii, it's in the southern hemisphere, so they flip. All right. Bum, bum, bum. So we talked about seasonal variations. We talked about photosynthesis. We talked about long-term trends. And again, super common question. So that in the carbon cycle, you can pretty much expect to see in October when we take this test. You could expect to see it on mock exams. And you likely can expect to see it on the IB exam in May. I'm just going to really quick buzz through here and see if there's anything else that is worth mentioning or highlighting. And then we're going to turn over to our next topic. So let's go with So I'm going to stop sharing. Boop. And then I'm going to pull up my other presentation on D4.2. Just bear with me for 30 seconds here. Now, I have good news and bad news, depending on where you lie with your course selections. But this is the first time in D4.2 that we're actually going to see some HL content. So Maya, are you doing HL?
Yes.
And Guyan, you're also doing HL, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is some content here. I don't think we'll get to it on HL. And this is the first time in ecology that we'll see HL. Good news is on your test in October, since there's so much gosh darn stuff, I will not include any HL questions on that test in October. So it'll just be the SL content because there's plenty of that. So D4.2 is all about stability and change. And to be honest with you, again, as we've seen in all of these kind of subtopics, there's a lot of redundancy. So early on, we talked about the current extinction event that humans have caused. Do you all recall what the extinction event we're currently in is called? Like what the fancy term for it is?
I forgot.
I think it's called the Anthropocene. So we're currently driving species to extinction in record numbers, and that's all due to the population of humans expanding and threatening habitat and resources of other organisms. And so a lot of what we're going to see here in stability and change kind of relates back to that first subtopic we talked about. I think it was A4, in which we got into threats to ecosystems, threats to animals, and whatnot. And so a big term that we want to tackle when we talk about all this stuff is stability, because all ecosystems, all biomes, all biospheres are trying to achieve equilibrium. And here we've got a Karen, not like the Karen that threatens to call the manager, but a rock Karen, or Karn, I think sometimes they're pronounced. And a lot of people like to create these in kind of parks and natural spaces. Sometimes they're meant to be like trail markers, but I think people just enjoy kind of making them. But you can see this particular Karn or Karen has achieved stability or equilibrium. And that's what our ecosystems are trying to achieve. And some ecosystems, depending on the number of kind of what we call feedback mechanisms, are more stable than others, and some are very fragile. And it wouldn't take much to destabilize them. When an ecosystem has undergone a loss of stability, that's referred to as a tipping point. And so many people are concerned about when Earth's systems, particularly our ocean currents, will reach a tipping point, because ocean currents drive weather. And a tipping point could drive Western Europe into an ice age. And so that's something that everyone is keeping an eye on right now, is the stability of oceans and ocean currents. I'm sure you're all familiar with the famous game Jenga. Sometimes you see these on a bigger scale, like at restaurants, where they've created these giant Jenga games out of like 2x4s, like big pieces of wood. And I always wonder, like, what if that crushes a small child? But most Jenga games are pretty small, and you can just play them on a tabletop. But what this is meant to illustrate is stability, but also what happens when you reach a tipping point. A good analogy would be that, like, each one of these blocks is kind of like a feedback mechanism, or a path that the ecosystem can use to maintain its stability. And so every time a player takes a block out of that tower, whether that's by driving a species to extinction, or introducing pollution, or perhaps eliminating habitat, that tower is becoming less and less and less and less stable. And eventually it's going to fall, and that's going to be a tipping point. And when a tipping point is achieved, in nature, we can stack this Jenga game back up and play again, but in nature you can't go back to the way the ecosystem was. That's really the sign of a tipping point. It's just your inability to reverse, your inability to go back to its original state. Although humans are prolific in terms of our population, there are natural spaces, there are wild spaces out there that still haven't been touched by humans. And so there are forests, there are tundras, taigas, deserts that have largely been undisturbed. And we can study these forests and learn a lot about some of the systems, whether they're negative or positive feedback loops, that are keeping these ecosystems stable. And this is all about our friend Switzerland. And so there are some parts of Switzerland, some remote valleys that have largely been undisturbed, and we can learn a lot about how they maintain their stability. Have you guys ever been to the virgin forest of Derborens in Canton Wallis?
Not yet.
Not yet. Me neither. Me neither. It looks pretty. And so I mentioned before different kind of feedback mechanisms, but there's some other things that really impact the stability of an ecosystem. And so we're going to take a look at what some of those things are. And so one big thing is how efficiently nutrients cycle throughout an ecosystem. So if you recall, well, Maya, you wouldn't remember this, but Guyan, we talked about how ecosystems are open systems, and so they allow nutrients to come in and out, and they allow energy to come in and out. But biomes, larger ecosystems, large collections of ecosystems, and especially the biosphere, are a closed system. And so what that means basically is, sure, we get energy from the sun, and energy leaves our biosphere as heat, but all the matter is just cycled throughout the ecosystem over and over and over again. We can't create any more, and we can't lose it. And that's due to the laws of thermodynamics. And so nutrient cycles and how efficient those nutrient cycles are really have a huge impact on the stability of an ecosystem.
I just want to make sure it still shows that you're on the first slide.
Oh, weird. Huh.
I don't think that's my internet, but
Guy,
there.
is that true? Is it just on the first slide? Can you see my whole window now?
I can see it.
Okay, and so if I hit play, now can you see this? What does structural and functional stability of an ecosystem depend on?
I think it allows you to present, but I could see it beforehand. Like, I think now it's gonna just like use it.
Guyan, what about you? Can you see this? Guyan, are you there? Maybe Guyan went to the bathroom. If I have it like this, can you see it? Like where it's not in present mode?
I can see it now.
Okay, so maybe I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna try to share it in a different way, and maybe it'll let me see something. So let's go entire screen. Should we do that? Boom. And now I'm gonna hit play. How about now? Can you see see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I think we lost Guyan, but she's maybe back. Gonna let her in maybe. Okay. Boom, 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 boom. I think we're all here. Okay, so let's try it one more time. So we talked about how efficiently nutrients are cycled through an ecosystem that impacts stability. Genetic diversity is also a huge factor in the stability of an ecosystem. So a rainforest has a tremendous amount of genetic diversity, so it can withstand a little bit more in interference or impact than perhaps a ecosystem with less genetic diversity. And the same goes for animals. I hear someone trying to come in. Oh, we lost Guyan. Maybe Guyun pulled the plug on the internet again. And so variation is incredibly important when it comes to stability. And so as we eliminate species, as more species become threatened, that becomes an issue as well. There's how tolerant an ecosystem is has a huge impact on its stability. And so some ecosystems, some biomes, some biospheres are more tolerant, or they have a larger zone of tolerance than others. And so that's another huge impact. How much humans are interfering with the ecosystems is a huge factor to consider. And then finally, just how regularly ecosystems are getting energy via sunlight. So all of these are helping to maintain ecosystems. And so if we mess around, if we eliminate any of these, then our ecosystem becomes much more fragile. It's beeping at me, so maybe Guyan is trying to get back in. Let's see. Guyan, where are you? Oh, maybe she's not. Okay. So what's the takeaway message here? You basically would just bullet point these. What are some requirements for the stability of an ecosystem? You wouldn't necessarily have to memorize all 4 or all 5, I should say, but just knowing 2 or 3 would be really, really helpful. Specifically, there's also some things that humans do that have a huge impact, and this is a little bit of a callback to when we were talking about Hippo. Hippo is a mnemonic device that we learned about in A4.2 or A4.1. Different ways that humans impact ecosystems, but erosion, over harvesting, eutrophication, and poaching and overhunting all have. Yep.
Betty's telling me if you can, or asking me if you can let her in.
Okay, let's try. Okay, where are you? All right, I want to admit people. 1 or more persons wants to join the call. All right, where are you here, bud? Let's see here. Where are you? Oh, close. Boom. All right. Bring in. Here we go. Guy in your back.
Yeah.
Oh, we were worried sick about you. I'm so sorry. We were just kind of talking about some things that affect the stability of ecosystems. And again, this is a little redundant. We learned about this in A4, but there's just some various really specific things that typically humans are responsible for that interfere with stability and that can cause a tipping point. Do you know what eutrophication is?
No.
Okay. And so in America, and I don't know if this is necessarily true of the whole world, Americans love having green lawns. We just love our grass to be very green and healthy. And in order to accomplish that, we use lots of fertilizers. But the problems with fertilizers is that, oftentimes we use them in excess and they don't necessarily go away, and they contain lots of nitrogen and lots of phosphate. And so if you live in a city and you're regularly using fertilizers on your lawn and it rains, all that fertilizer will wash through your soil and then it goes into the sewer systems. And in the US, and I don't know if this is necessarily true of the Middle East or Europe, but a lot of our sewer systems or a lot of our storm systems lead into like small lakes, especially within cities. And so suddenly you get all this fertilizer that's running into your lakes. And what that does is it causes huge explosions of algae. And I'm sure you've all seen algae. It's kind of the green slimy stuff that you find in ponds, especially when those ponds are stagnant or not flowing freely. But in these small lakes, these algae blooms can just explode. And what that does though is that it basically suffocates every living thing in that lake, because that algae is, number one, it's covering the surface, so it's making it a little trickier for sunlight to get through the water and for aquatic plants to photosynthesize. But then at the same time, that algae is using up all that carbon dioxide in the water. And so there's nothing really for other plants to utilize to undergo photosynthesis. And then the algae can start to die, and that can impact the amounts of oxygen in the water as well. And so that can choke out the fish. So eutrophication is really human driven, and you see it a lot in cities that don't have laws regarding fertilizers and lawns and whatnot. And you also see it near agricultural areas. So farmers are obviously going to use fertilizers to grow crops. Those fertilizers are going to go somewhere. That's going to cause these huge algae blooms. Those algae blooms are basically going to suffocate lakes and turn them into what we call dead zones. So there's no living things there. There's been some pretty extreme measures taken to combat eutrophication. Many lakes now have these specialized, almost like lawn mowers. And someone from the parks department will go once a week and they'll basically mow all the algae off the top of the lake so that it doesn't choke off all the fish or all the other aquatic plants. All right. And specifically, like we had talked about those 5 different things that can happen to ecosystems, and this is how specifically these different practices are impacting one of those 5 things. And so, for example, erosion is going to really impact the cycling of nutrients, for example, or poaching is going to really inhibit or impact genetic diversity. And Maya, you can still see these slides. Cool. A particular place where we see just a huge example of humans impacting ecosystems would be the Amazon rainforest. And it's important to remember that with these kinds of situations, no one is really at fault. So if you're living in the Amazon rainforest, you are trying to feed your family, you're trying to get by. You aren't really necessarily trying to harm anyone. You're not trying to do anything, bad. You're just trying to survive, right? And so if somebody presents you with the opportunity to do some farming, and in order to do that farming, you have to cut down or burn a bunch of trees, you're going to do that, right? Because you want your kids to be happy and healthy. And so I think we tend to villainize people who impact ecosystems, but that's not fair because their reality is much different than ours. And so in the Amazon rainforest, we're seeing lots of people trying to establish farms, and in doing so, they're doing a lot of slash and burn. So they're cutting down huge segments of the rainforest and burning them so that they can have viable cropland. And you might ask yourself, well, why don't they just like log it and then sell the trees and then start their farms? But in the rainforest, a lot of the nutrients in that nutrient cycle, it's not in the soil. The soil in the Amazon rainforest is actually pretty poor. It's not very nutrient rich because all those nutrients are in the vegetation. And so by burning all those trees and bushes and shrubs, they're returning some of those nutrients to the soil so that they can then grow crops. And so I don't know if the burning of the rainforest has slowed down. There's definitely a lot more attention to it, but I think you can hop on the internet and find maps of what percentage of the rainforest is currently burning, and I don't think it's decreased in any way. And so here's an example of some of the deforestation taking place. In addition to agriculture, though, something that might be a little bit more troubling is mining. And so with mining, again, do you have people on the ground who, are just trying to earn a paycheck to feed their family? Absolutely. But you also have some pretty, shady mining outfits and international corporations that aren't necessarily even Brazilian, that are coming in and have secured mining rights to get natural resources, whether that's gold or silver or lithium, you name it. And they're exploiting these areas. And a lot of the stuff that they're mining for isn't even being used in Brazil or in Paraguay or in Colombia or wherever. It's being exported out. And so that's a little bit more troubling as well. And so what that's going to do is potentially drive the rainforest to a tipping point. And we're already seeing this. And so when tipping points occur in ecosystems, they don't stop being ecosystems. They just become a different type of ecosystem. And so instead of being a rainforest, it becomes almost like a tropical savanna. And we're seeing that more and more throughout the rainforest, and that's having huge impacts on the numbers of species that are able to live there, because they no longer have the things that they need to be successful. If you have some time, there's a really cool online tool in which, again, you can kind of see the impacts of deforestation in the rainforest region. Now, that just to clarify, the rainforest isn't this entire green area. The rainforest is really up. You see Manaus right here, where my cursor is. This is the heart of the rainforest, right? And this is a really remote city that you have to fly to. You can't necessarily, I guess you could try to get to it by car, but it'd be really tricky. But this is the heart of the rainforest. And then the rainforest kind of goes down, and it's all along Paraguay and Bolivia. But once you get into like Brasilia and stuff, it stops being the rainforest. And then on the east coast here, this is all mid-Atlantic rainforest. It's a different type of rainforest, but it's also really cool. All right, more cool things you can check out. And as I mentioned before, this is really where the rainforest is. And then once you get to like Bahia, this turns into some other types of ecosystems. Now I want you to visualize. I want you to think about. I want you to think about our classroom. And Dr. Price, with the 10th grader, loves to build these mesocosms. Do you recall these glass jars against the windows in the Bell Lab?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not a huge fan. I think they're kind of wasteful. The IB wants you to have students build a mesocosm, but they take a lot of time. They take a couple class periods to build, and then they just kind of sit there, and they're not that interesting. Oftentimes I've had kids try to like bring animals and put them in mesocosms, and the animals always die. And so even if they're bugs, and so most teachers now limit mesocosms just to plants, because we don't want a bunch of dead animals on our hands. But a mesocosm is essentially just a self-contained closed system. And so what I mean again by that is within this glass jar, there's no more nutrients coming in or going out. It's sealed. However, energy is still able to move freely. It's transparent, so light can come in, and then heat can also escape. And it's just a really cool way for you to study how sustainable a particular ecosystem can be over time. And there are some mesocosms in the Bell Lab and some in the environmental science lab that have been sitting there for a long time, and they're still doing okay. This little guy who kind of looks like Bilbo Baggins, this little hobbit guy, this fella made this mesocosm like in the 70s, and it still exists and still thriving today. And so whenever we talk about mesocosms, there's always a little article on this little British hobbit guy and his mesocosm. He's pretty excited about it. So just through the process of like cell respiration and photosynthesis, a lot of that carbon is able to move from one place to another. Another kind of big highlight or a big feature of this particular section is this notion of keystone species. And so Guyan, you probably remember this, but Maya obviously was absent. Do you remember what a trophic level is?
Oh, isn't that like, wait, like there's a thing and then it goes up.
Yeah, like a pyramid, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it
Yeah.
how much like the organism, like how much of the energy an organism consumes or how much it keeps from an organism when it feeds?
Yeah. There's definitely movement of energy from one trophic level to another. What's at the base of our energy pyramid? Do you recall? What is
Was that like producers? Something?
Yeah, producers are plants. I heard Maya say plants. Absolutely. And so that's usually the first trophic level are our producers, and they're converting sunlight into glucose. That's primary productivity. The plants use some of that sugar for obviously their own growth and to sustain themselves, and that's referred to as gross, not gross like ew, but gross like in total primary productivity. And then there's some sugar that can be passed on to the next level, the primary consumers, the herbivores, and that's called net primary productivity. Now, that's a really incredibly inefficient process. Do you recall what percentage of energy actually gets transferred from one trophic level to another?
Isn't it like 10%?
Yeah, it's just 10% because a lot of it is lost through cell respiration as heat. So if you recall, cell respiration is just a really inefficient form of combustion. And as we convert glucose into ATP, a lot of that energy in that catabolic reaction is going to escape as heat. In addition, organisms don't necessarily eat every part of whatever they're eating. And so some of it doesn't get digested. Sometimes we can't digest every part of the organism that we're eating. And so it's a wildly kind of inefficient process, but it's still more efficient than combustion. The reason why I bring up trophic levels, again, we've got producers, primary producers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, et cetera. But at the top of that pyramid, we usually find organisms which we refer to as keystone species. Keystone species. And in an arch, the keystone is the stone at the middle of the arch that helps support the force from both sides of the arch. And in this analogy, a keystone species is a incredibly vital part of an ecosystem. And if you were to remove those keystone species, the whole ecosystem would likely collapse. And so in this case, we're going to look at beavers. And there are beavers in Switzerland, I assume. I think there are. There's definitely beavers all over North America. Someone introduced beavers to South America, and they become this out of control problem in places like Patagonia. But beavers are very, very much a keystone species. And this is largely due to their drive to create dams. And so in creating dams, then they create ponds, and in creating ponds, they create this whole new habitat that has all these opportunities for different species called realized niches. And so they are very, very much a keystone species, a great example of one. And so on a test, you would be asked, what's an example of a keystone species? And then essentially what it is. And so it's a organism that basically supports an entire ecosystem. There are places where like a wolf would be a keystone species. There's a national park near where I live called Isle Royal, and wolves are vital to the health of the ecosystem on that island. They keep the moose populations in check, and the moose populations then keep a bunch of different plant populations in check. But then there are other ecosystems where something really unassuming, like a plant or a fungus, might be a keystone species. You could maybe consider eucalyptus to be a keystone species because without it, koalas wouldn't be able to survive. And so here's a lovely little diagram of all the different organisms that are dependent upon our friend, the beaver. Even wild horses back there. It's kind of cool. And so I mentioned they're not always flashy. They're not always like big species. And so in Switzerland, amphipods are keystone species. So these little guys, and they help with decomposition, which is a flux or a flow, a way carbon moves from one way to another. Now, sometimes keystone species are also this other type of classification called indicator species. And so with an indicator species, you can monitor the health of that particular species, and it gives you insights into the health of the ecosystem as a whole. And so oftentimes we use amphibians, for example, as indicator species, because as you know, amphibians spend a lot of time in water. And they're very, very sensitive to pollutants in the water. And so if frogs are dying off, that would tell us that there's something definitely going on in that particular aquatic ecosystem. All right. So the last part of this is just to focus on sustainability. And so much of this ecological unit is kind of depressing. But the last half of D4 and then our next unit, C4, is about, okay, what can humans do to turn the ship around? What can humans do to kind of correct some of the issues that we're seeing with the problems that we've created? And so it really gets into natural resource management and sustainability. And one practice that's heavily discussed is sustainable agriculture. And you don't necessarily think about it, but the way we manage forests is a form of agriculture. We don't necessarily eat trees, but trees are a incredibly important resource, and excuse me. And there are many places in the world where we can sustainably manage forests and get natural resources like wood and paper from them without impacting the ecosystem. And so Finland is a great example of sustainably managed forests. They've got a number of forests that have existed for thousands and thousands of years and continuously regenerate themselves. There's quite a few forests around where I live, around the Great Lakes, that have been sustainably managed by Native American tribes for hundreds of thousands of years. It's important also to remember that we need to sustainably manage our aquatic ecosystems. And so over harvesting or overfishing is a huge problem. And so we're seeing an increase in fisheries that are practicing sustainable harvesting practices to maintain fish populations. We also see this quite a bit with aquatic arthropods like lobster or crabs or crayfish, where lobster fishermen are very careful about what lobsters they catch and which lobsters they release, because they need to continue in that livelihood, and maybe their children will continue in that livelihood, but they can't if there's no lobsters to catch. And so they're very cautious at releasing, or cautious about releasing female lobsters, for example, because without female lobsters, you can't get baby lobsters. There's a few resources on sustainable fishing here, and a few more resources about sustainable agriculture. Now, this was a question on this year's IB exam. What are some ways that we can get around, or we can get away from industrial agriculture and return to more sustainable practices? And the biggest thing that we need to start working on is avoiding monocultures. And so a monoculture is really common these days. It's where you're just growing one type of crop. And so across the Midwest of the United States, all you see is corn, for example. Or if you were to go to Asia, you'd see rice fields for acres and acres and acres. Or if you were to go to Eastern Europe, you'd see wheat forever. And that's really problematic for ecosystems, because it eliminates a lot of those feedback mechanisms, and it makes it really difficult for ecosystems to thrive and survive. And so rotating crops, growing multiple crops at the same time, is one of the best ways that we can eliminate problems in agriculture and make agriculture more sustainable. In addition, minimizing the use of fertilizers and pesticides is another really big one. And we're tackling this in a lot of different ways. There's a robot that was released that uses a laser to zap weeds instead of using chemical herbicides. There's genetically modified crops that are resistant to insects and different pests, so you don't have to use fertilizers. So there's lots and lots of different ways that we can go about avoiding those things. In addition, composting has become more and more prolific, because we want to maintain the quality of our soil, right? And so we know that 70% of our landfills are filled with organic material. And so if we can prevent that organic material from getting into our landfills and we can compost it, we then can use it to maintain the health of our soil. We already talked a little bit about eutrophication. And so here's an example of an algae bloom. You can see, you wouldn't want to swim in there, would you? I hope not. It's pretty nasty. But again, it's basically, we get fertilizers and pesticides running into water sources. Algae then blooms, carbon dioxide and oxygen levels drop, that chokes out all the fish, and eventually those water bodies are considered a dead zone. All right, I'm just going to skip ahead. I think, let's see here. I'm just going to look. We only have a couple minutes. Ooh, let's just talk a little bit about biomagnification. What else you got on the agenda today? It's what time? 7 o'clock in Saudi?
Yes.
And are you still at the mall, Maya?
I am, yes.
Yeah.
And
How
there
much,
are a lot of kids screaming.
how much more shopping do you have to do?
Well, it's not that I have to do shopping anymore. It's there's a theater here.
Oh, okay.
The Spider-Man movie. At
Oh, that's
6:30, I
good.
think.
Oh, very cool. I saw that last week. It was very good. All right. So let's talk a little bit about bioaccumulation and biomagnification. And so bioaccumulation is essentially where a toxin gets stored in fat tissues. So many toxins are not water soluble. And so they can't be dissolved in water. And so they have a tendency in organisms to accumulate in our fat tissue. And so a big one, and this is particularly troubling for pregnant women, is mercury. Oftentimes, when you go see your OBGYN after you become pregnant, they really caution you against eating sushi or fresh fish. And the reason why they're concerned about that is the presence of mercury. And so we use mercury still to this day for a lot of different industrial practices. It's not very healthy for people. If you recall, we used to use it in thermometers, and we used to use it to cure hats and stuff. But it has a lot of really negative health impacts. So what happens over time is something known as bioaccumulation. So that mercury never goes away, and it just continues to add up and add up and add up in the fat tissues of organisms. And in this case, we're talking fish. But what's more problematic is something called biomagnification. So if you recall, as we move up the food chain, an organism isn't just eating one of something. It's eating lots and lots of something in order to sustain itself, because again, so much of that energy is being lost as heat. And so by the time you get to a killer whale, that killer whale is eating lots and lots of seals. And those seals have been eating lots and lots of fish. And those fish have been eating lots and lots of smaller critters. And all of those organisms have experienced bioaccumulation. And so that killer whale is getting a much higher dose of whatever particular chemical that we're concerned with than perhaps some of the organisms further down the food chain. So essentially what you're being asked to do here is just differentiate between bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So bioaccumulation is the tendency of things that are not soluble to accumulate in our fat tissues. And this happens to everyone. And then biomagnification is the notion is as you move up the food chain, organisms are exposed to greater and greater numbers or greater and greater amounts of these chemicals. With humans, what we're really obsessed with lately are microplastics, right? Everything, man, everything is made up of plastic these days, right? And biomagnification happens with us. And so as these plastics break down into smaller and smaller bits, they're absorbed through feeding. And as you move up the food chain to humans, they tend to accumulate. And like, man, they test people now, and there are microplastics in breast milk. There's microplastics in our blood. There's microplastics in our muscle tissue. And this isn't going to go away. It's not going to become better because plastic is everywhere, and we still don't have any effective means to recycle it. So I hate to say it, but although we ask you to recycle plastic bottles, all that stuff just gets sent to a landfill and buried with the rest of your waste. The only thing that humans are effective at recycling is glass, aluminum, steel, and cardboard. Plastic, for a long time, it was sent to places like China and India, but now China and India are like, we're done. And so you can't, like, more developed nations or more wealthy nations now just take it out to a landfill and bury it. It's really kind of a shame. All right. A little bit here on restoration, but I think we're out of time. So there we are. There we are. Now, just a heads up, next week, my son and I are going to do the Tour de Mont Blanc. So we'll be out backpacking. And so I will not be here next Sunday, but I'll try to sneak in one more session before school starts when we get back, if that's okay with you. So no session next Sunday, but I will give you a ample warning. I'll give you a heads up when we'll talk about our very, very last section in this ecology unit. All good?
Yes. And
Okay.
also, I'm not sure if you shared these slideshows from today. I see like some other documents, but I don't know if I can see that slideshow.
Yeah, it was just like my Google Drive was acting up and it said it was too big, too big to share. So I'm going to try to go to a place with better internet. So, and maybe that's the limiting factor. But I'll try to get those up for you as well as this recording and whatnot. And then I'll also highlight the things to really focus on in the study guide so that you don't feel bogged down by all the content.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Enjoy Spider-Man. Spoiler alert, Spider-Man dies.
Yeah, of course.
I'm just kidding. All right. Have a great day, Guyan. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and tell Guyun that she's a wonderful person, and I can't wait to see her in 2 weeks.
Okay.
All right. Bye, kiddo. See you guys.
Bye bye.
Bye.